I think that when you're first getting into fighting games, one of the most formative part of a lot of people's experiences is playing through a game's arcade ladder and getting to the big boss at the end. Whether it's Bison, Geese, Shao Kahn, or everyone else in between, fighting game bosses are often a true test of skill and patience in the face of overwhelming, sometimes deliberately jacked up odds. And that's after getting over how imposing and intimidating they can often be. As a kid, I'd always get really anxious when I got to a final boss in a fighting game. I'm talking sweating a bit and jittery hands anxious. And while they might not have been harder than the cheapest SNK stuff like Rugal or completely wacky stuff like Kaiser Knuckles General, there's one fighting game final boss that very distinctly commanded my attention.
Know my name and fear it. I am Onslaught.
Onslaught is the final boss of Marvel vs. Capcom Clash of Superheroes. Onslaught is an immensely powerful psionic energy being formed from a combination of Magneto's evil, along with Charles Xavier's darkest impulses and frustrations. When exactly Onslaught formed definitively is something still debated to this day, but the main catalyst was confirmed to be the Fatal Attraction storyline in Volume 2 of the early 90s X-Men run. The climax of that storyline involves a confrontation with Magneto and his acolytes on the space station Avalon. Wolverine attacks Magneto, and having lost his patience with him, the latter forcefully rips out all of the adamantium from Wolverine's body, nearly killing him. Xavier, in a rare moment of rage, uses his telepathy to dive deep into Magneto's mind and puts him into a coma. This psionic energy would start taking form within Xavier's mind soon after, moving on to the next stages of its plan, finding an appropriate physical form. If that sounds even vaguely familiar to some of you fighting game fans out there, it's likely because the plot of Fatal Attractions was very loosely adapted for X-Men Children of the Atom, Capcom's first Marvel fighting game. Onslaught was infamously foreshadowed throughout X-Men and X-Men adjacent books for a full year, the first big moment coming when he encounters Juggernaut. Juggernaut had found out who Onslaught was, but Onslaught put a mental block on him to keep him from recalling the memory, and uses his powers to fling him clear into New Jersey. And I mean literally, Juggernaut goes flying from Canada into New Jersey. He also tries to enlist Jean Grey into his crusade by forcefully whisking her to the astral plane to make his case. She refuses, but is left traumatized by Onslaught, wondering who or what exactly he is. Juggernaut reluctantly goes to seek out Jean Grey for help, earning her trust when he willingly removes his helmet so that she can dive into his mind. It's soon revealed after Jean Grey goes into Juggernaut's mind that Onslaught is Charles Xavier, or at least made in his image anyway. Onslaught then enacts a plan to wage war on humanity, capture the two most powerful mutants known at the time, Franklin Richards, the son of the Fantastic Four's Reed Richards and Sue Storm, and Nate Grey, a ridiculously powerful alternate reality counterpart to Cable that hails from the Age of Apocalypse alternate reality. That's a whole big other thing, maybe some other time. After collecting the two along with Xavier, he takes control of the world's Sentinels and forms a protective barrier around Manhattan, cutting it off from the outside world. He then engages in a climactic battle against the combined forces of the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, and the X-Men before finally being defeated in his psionic energy form, but not without a cost. Many heroes, like most of the Avengers, the Fantastic Four, and even Doctor Doom, sacrificed themselves to defeat Onslaught. As it turns out, this was a ploy by Marvel Editorial to reboot some of these heroes in a new universe. The less said about that, the better. Funny thing about the Juggernaut stuff. Juggernaut was chosen to lose to Onslaught early on as they wanted to establish him as a massive threat. However, the fight was off screen and Onslaught isn't actually seen in the issue because he actually hadn't been created yet beyond the name, and was just a vague threat Marvel Editorial wanted to introduce. After the details of Onslaught were decided upon and the story moved forwards, this sort of became a bit of accidental hilarity that the story actually acknowledges. With the knowledge that Onslaught was Xavier, it makes all the sense in the world that his very first victim he would lash out against would be Juggernaut, the man that tormented him from his youth, which Onslaught freely admits. I grew up on the Marvel vs. games and have great memories of them, but the most vivid of them all involve Onslaught. My father was a big comic book fan and got me into it at a really young age. But while I had been reading some Marvel stuff around the time that I played Marvel 1 for the first time, Onslaught was a completely new character to me. Seeing him for the first time blew my mind. Who is this guy? Why does he look like a Magneto Gundam? Why does he sound so cool? Why does he have Magneto's attack? Is that Professor X? Onslaught is more or less the reason I became a huge comic book fan. I just had to know more about him. While the actual comic book event that featured him was kind of not stellar despite some really good setup, most people generally tend to agree that Onslaught is probably most memorable as the final boss of Marvel vs. Capcom. Onslaught's voice in this game is provided by Maurice Dean Wint. He's done acting work in movies and TV for a while, most relevantly providing the Shadow King's voice in X-Men the Animated Series, and the voice of Pride Falcon, Edward Falcon's father in the Power Stone anime. He'd also go on to voice the main character in another Capcom comic book game, Spawn in the Demon's Hand. In the game's continuity, things are mostly the same but with one key difference. Xavier sends out a telepathic distress call across universes to the Capcom universe, as he fears that Onslaught will be way too powerful for just the Marvel heroes to stop, thus setting up the game stage. Onslaught is an unplayable boss in the arcade version of Marvel vs. Capcom, but was made a secret playable character in the console ports of the game, very similarly to Apocalypse and Cyber Akuma, the previous Versus series bosses. The method of unlocking him differs between consoles, however. In the PS1 version, simply beat the game once and on the character select screen, highlight Wolverine and press down to find Onslaught. Unlocking him in the Dreamcast version is a bit more involved, however. First, you have to unlock every hidden character in the game and save them to your VMU. You can't cheat by using the character select codes either. You have to fulfill the requirements to encounter them in the arcade ladder and beat them there to unlock them. Once you've done that and saved the game, a new Onslaught option appears on the main menu, which lets you play as Onslaught against a second player or against endless CPU opponents. Onslaught doesn't have the ability to jump, dash, or fly, only being able to move horizontally. But when his moveset is as good as it is, why would he need to? His first attack is Sentinel Force, which works similarly to how it does for Sentinel in Children of the Atom. He can do this by simply pressing punch or kick. Onslaught also gets unlimited use of the Sentinel Assist, done by pressing the button combo for assist characters, medium punch and medium kick at the same time. As I mentioned earlier, Onslaught takes control of the world's Sentinels at one point, turning them on the people of New York. Characters that weren't directly involved with the Onslaught conflict like Spider-Man still found themselves dealing with the fallout from this while the big battle against Onslaught took place. Quarter Circle Forward and Punch is Magnetic Tempest. This functions as a neat way to emphasize Onslaught's link to Magneto while also letting Capcom reuse some assets. Win-win. Also cribbed from Magneto is Hypergrav, which is now a Dragon Punch motion and punch. Note how much bigger and farther traveling Onslaught's variation goes. Quarter Circle Forward and Kick is Onslaught Head Crush. This functions pretty similarly to Juggernaut's Head Crush super in the series. I guess taking Juggernaut's pride wasn't enough for Onslaught, so he took his moves too. This one is likely based off of a maneuver he does when he attacks the X-Men at the X-Mansion. His attack dialogue here is also taken from the very same issue. Quarter Circle Back and Kick is a quick teleport. The kick button press determines where you teleport. Onslaught's first hyper combo is Hyper Mind Blast, a giant blast of energy he emits from his helmet. According to a Capcom artist, they originally wanted the blast to emit from his entire body, but Marvel insisted that the blast come from his head. The Know My Pain and Anger line he has here is also taken directly from the comics. Next up is another familiar one, Magnetic Shockwave, done with a quarter circle forward and 2 kicks. His Feel My Fury voice line comes from the same panel as the one for Head Crush. His most interesting hyper combo is Psionic Puppet, which requires 2 bars of meter. Onslaught teleports into the background and a random character from the roster comes in and fights on your behalf. You can't actually control them, they're entirely controlled by the CPU. After a while, Onslaught tags back in. This is taken from Onslaught's ability to take over the minds of others and forcing them to do his bidding. He did this in the comics a handful of times. If the battle against him goes down to 30 seconds on the clock or you lower his health to 0, congrats, you win. Except no. Unlike the previous Versus games where the final boss was either a 1-on-1 or 2-on-1 match against a humanoid opponent, Onslaught's the first boss in the series to have 2 distinct forms. And man, let me tell you, this had me shook as a kid. There was a pizza shop a few blocks away from my middle school that had a cabinet for this game, and my friends and I would frequent it a bunch after school. One day a friend of mine got up to Onslaught, which was normal, but actually got past his first form this time. Thing is, we had no idea there was a second form. So imagine our surprise when this massive second form with a skull visage comes out of nowhere and drops one of the hardest lines I've ever heard a fighting game boss say.
No one is safe.
So for this fight, you have to change up your entire approach. Onslaught can move freely across the screen and even fly up to just a bit over super jump height. His hurt box is his skull, which floats a bit above the ground, so some grounded specials and hyper combos won't actually reach him. Hitting the punch button has Onslaught do a claw swipe. This has a massive hitbox and comes out pretty fast, so try not to be near him when he does this. He retains his Sentinel Force summon by pressing any kick button. Quarter circle forward and punch is Mind Blast. This looks and functions very similarly to Captain Commando's Captain Corridor. He retains Hypergrav as well as the input it had in his first form. Quarter circle forward and kick has him duck off screen before rushing back in the frame with his claw outstretched. This does a ton of damage if it connects, and it functions really similarly to Apocalypse's drill attack in previous games. His lone hyper combo is Multi-Mind Blast, which has him fire multiple Mind Blasts at various positions across the stage. If you don't block the first one that hits you, say goodbye to a good chunk of your health. If you beat him, his armor dissipates and reveals a battered Professor Xavier. Onslaught's been beaten, but he still lingers on in his psionic form above Xavier. Pretty accurately represents his psionic form as depicted in the comics actually. Onslaught's stage is pretty nondescript and just looks like it's the top of a building, but this is actually the top of his citadel, which he manifests in the middle of Central Park in the comics, and is noted to even dwarf Manhattan's tallest skyscrapers in size. There's several buildings on fire in the background. At one point during the final confrontation with him in the comics, he lets out a massive dome of energy which damages nearly everything in the immediate vicinity. Wouldn't be surprised if it was a result of that. The only other notable feature of this stage is the large satellite dish to the far right, which is also depicted on the Citadel in the comics. While we're on the subject of comics, Onslaught hasn't really had a good go of it despite it being his home medium. His 1996 comic event isn't really all that great. Most people, myself included, generally consider the build up to him to be top notch, but the latter portions really fall flat. He'd be resurrected a few times over the course of a few years, and Red Skull would notably become a new version of him during Marvel's Axis event. However, he returned again during the most recent era of X-Men comics, the Krakoa era, and it's during this era that we finally got a good Onslaught story, and this video's comic book recommendation, The Onslaught Revelation. Krakoa is more or less a mutant nation founded by Xavier, Magneto, and Moira McTaggart. We don't have enough time to go into her, that's a whole big thing. If you're a mutant, or even married to one, you can claim citizenship. There's also a whole big thing going on where any mutant can be brought back to life via a process called the Resurrection Protocols, made possible by Xavier having mental backups of all mutants and 5 specific mutants using their powers in unison to make the process possible. Think of it as real-life save states, but for your mind. There's a lot of moral questions to ponder with that whole process, and quite a few things that can and have gone wrong with it, which the newly revived Onslaught seeks to exploit. Onslaught's presented as even more of a dark reflection to Xavier in this story, where he hopes to exploit young Krakoan minds that have a misguided outlook on death now that the resurrection protocols are a thing, and tries to goad them into committing acts of violence that might have otherwise given them pause before, all in the service of creating a mental trauma quake that'll restore his powers since he's nowhere near as powerful as he once was. It's the first interesting thing they've done with Onslaught in the comics, and unlike his original comic event, it's a short, self-contained read that really does call into question the vulnerability of people on Krakoa. I won't spoil the ending, but it's actually a really uplifting conclusion. I guarantee you won't guess how it goes down beforehand. In X-Men vs. Street Fighter, Apocalypse has special pre-fight dialogue with every character, and the same goes for Onslaught here. But Onslaught, for lack of a more appropriate term, has some savage-ass banter with the cast.
Hold it! Know my name and fear. I am Onslaught. Know my name and fear. I am Onslaught. Know my name and fear. I am Onslaught.
Come on, Mona.
Know my name and fear. I am Onslaught. 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 Know my name and fear. I am Onslaught.
Spider sense is tingling.
Know my name and fear. I am Onslaught. Know my name and fear. I am Onslaught. We are Venom. Know my name and fear. I am Onslaught. Know my name and fear. I am Onslaught. Let's go, Bob. Know my name and fear. I am Onslaught. Know my name and fear. I am Onslaught.
Ready. Fight!
I can't speak for everyone watching, but when I think of the most memorable Versus Series bosses, Onslaught is the first one that always comes to mind. He's nowhere near unbeatable, but he definitely makes you work a bit for it. And personally speaking, the only other ones in the series to give me trouble are God Rugal and Shin Akuma in the Capcom vs SNK 2. I'd almost say there's probably more people out there that remembered him more fondly for his appearance in Marvel 1 than his actual comic event. I wasn't actually sure if I was going to cover the bosses for the series, since not all of them are playable in their respective games. But Onslaught is just too cool and had too big of an impact on me to ignore. Let me know if you want me to actually cover people like Apocalypse and Galactus somewhere down the line. That said, that's going to do it for this video. I want to thank everyone for watching, like and subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, I'll catch you next time.